we have Val Curran with us from University College London. Over to you, Val.
Okay. All right, so I'm a scientist. I'm not a policy maker, so forgive me. I'm going to talk about how can science help inform drug policy, and I hope to reiterate some of what Ruth has just been saying about what happens to the science of drugs when it's left to criminal gangs.
Give a sign to this person.
Oh, can I not just change it here?
No.
Oh, okay. I'll have to. I go quite fast, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, all the drugs we're talking about act on the brain. The brain is the main target of all recreational drugs, and understanding drugs and their effects on our brains and how we behave is critical to developing treatment for people with drug problems and preventing young children developing problems. It gives us a better understanding of how to reduce the harms of drugs, both to the user and to society. And I think what I understand about drug policy are those two things are central to drug policy, reducing harms. So in 15 minutes, I'm trying to give you an idea, taking an example of the world's most popular illicit drug, cannabis, and just give you a flavour of new findings on this drug, both in terms of its harms and in terms of its very exciting medical use. And if I have time at the end, I want to present what we've been doing in the UK with David Nutt on the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, trying to rank all abused drugs on a continuum, which we hope will have direct implications for drug policy in many different countries. Talking of cannabis, most people who use cannabis actually use without having any negative effects at all. Queen Victoria used cannabis throughout her long, long reign in the UK. Her GP prescribed her tincture of cannabis. She used it for her period pains and for all her childbirth. The young man with the red circle there is our Prime Minister, David Cameron, who got caught buying cannabis when he was at school in Slough with 7 other people. The 7 others got thrown out of Eton, thrown out of the school. David Cameron was made to spend 2 weeks copying out Latin poetry. How history would have been different if he'd have been thrown out then. And then, of course, we have the famous pot smoker Barack Obama, who only in January said that I don't think cannabis is more dangerous than alcohol. So most people who do smoke cannabis actually go on to have fairly important jobs, at least don't end up in prison. But there are harms with cannabis, and the 3 main ones are in terms of mental health: psychosis, addiction, and memory impairment. Psychosis, we know that long-term use of cannabis actually doubles a young person's risk of developing a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia if they're vulnerable. Sorry, can you go back? If they're vulnerable for other reasons, genetic reasons, and reasons in terms of their childhood. And very importantly, it leads to onset of schizophrenia 2 or 3 years earlier than it would have happened if they had not used cannabis. Memory impairment, anyone who smoked cannabis would be familiar with that. We know exactly how it works in the brain. We have cannabis receptors very densely in that blue area of the brain, which is the hippocampus, the centre of memory. But the long-term effects of cannabis on memory are inconsistent, and it's not completely clear that it will impinge on people's performance long-term. Certainly while you're smoking cannabis, young children at school and at college will be experiencing problems learning. But the most extraordinary thing to me that's happened in the last few years is addiction. When I was at university, when there were still dinosaurs around, there were hardly any people who were addicted to cannabis. This is something that's happened in the last few years. Of the 180 million users worldwide, about 11% fulfill all clinical criteria for addiction. And in Europe, this is recent data that's come out from ECMDDA and other organisations, 1% of all adults and nearly 2% of 14 to 7-year-old children are addicted. And it's become cannabis addiction is the reason for new referrals for drug treatment in 28% of all cases in Europe now. So it's second only to heroin at 41%. This is an extraordinary change. Why has this happened? Well, cannabis isn't one drug. People talk about cannabis as that's it. But it's not. It's a very, very complicated plant, and it contains over 100 unique ingredients that we call cannabinoids. Okay. The two most prominent ones are THC, and that's what makes people stoned. It's why they smoke it. But there's a very important other ingredient called CBD, or cannabidiol. And in a way, these two compounds are like the yin and yang in cannabis. THC makes you anxious, it produces psychotic effects, it impairs memory. CBD does the opposite, reduces anxiety, it has antipsychotic effects, even some effectiveness as a treatment in schizophrenia. It improves learning and it blocks the THC memory loss. In the brain, they have opposite effects on our cannabis receptors. So we were wondering, is part of this huge increase in addiction to do with the fact of CBD not being present? We wanted to know if CBD can protect cannabis users against the harmful effects of THC. Now, if I was doing this with any legal drug, what I would do is do a clinical trial, a randomized clinical trial. So I'd give a third of people cannabis with both THC and CBD, 4 weeks, a third with THC only for 4 weeks, and a third an inactive placebo. And I'd compare them before, then at 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I can't do that because it's illegal. So I have to find clever ways around it. Hair is a way we've found. Your hair grows 1 centimetre a month, and inside your hair there's a shaft which keeps a record very nicely of all the drugs you've used. Okay? So we can have hair analysed, so each month representing 1 centimetre, and you can see someone's intake over a year depending on how long their hair is. So for you, that'd be about 2 months, I could tell. And we got people together. We found that in 20 young people's hair there was only THC. I guess it should be about 40 people had both CBD and THC in their hair, and the majority actually had neither, 86. And all these people, we did a standard clinical assessment of psychosis, which is called the O-Life. And what we found was that the red curve, the red bar, is those who only had THC. They were experiencing much more of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia at a subclinical level than either of the other two. So, to put it in other words, if you had no cannabinoids in your hair, you were fine. If you had THC only, you had higher levels of hallucinations and delusions. But if you had both THC and CBD, you were absolutely fine as well. So this suggests to us that CBD can protect you against the harmful effects of THC. We then went on to do a naturalistic study with a bigger group, 600 young people, 16 to 23-year-olds. We can't work with less than 16-year-olds because they have to ask their parents to consent to them taking part in research. And you can imagine saying, Mum and Dad, I'm only 13, but I smoke cannabis, can I do research? It doesn't work. So we had them smoke their own cannabis, and these people would all use for a year. And we tested them on one day when they were intoxicated with their own cannabis, another day when sober, and the half the group we tested the other way round. And we assessed them on the main harms of cannabis, and we also took a sample of the cannabis they'd actually smoked and got it analysed for CBD and THC, and looked at CBD and THC in lots of other biological samples. So just to give you some examples, what we found with memory function is when people, the red bar again is the bar where there's no CBD, so it's skunk type cannabis. The green bar is where the cannabis is high in CBD. So when these two groups were not intoxicated, they were fine, there was no difference. But when they were intoxicated, the people who were having skunk, THC without CBD, showed a severe impairment of memory. The people with CBD in their cannabis were absolutely fine again. Another thing that drugs do, all sorts of drugs, if you're addicted, it attracts your attention towards drugs in the environment. So an alcoholic will go down a supermarket lane and see the alcohol before seeing anything else. The same with somebody who might be addicted to cannabis. And okay, it's fine. Again, if the person has CBD in their cannabis, that effect disappeared. So that's a big, strong indication of addiction, that again CBD was protecting people against becoming addicted to cannabis. We also found those who preferred skunk, the high THC, low CBD varieties, of the 600, there were significantly more cannabis-addicted people to skunk. They smoked 3.5 grams much faster. They craved cannabis more when they were sober. And they had more THC and no CBD, both in their cannabis and in their hair. So what's happening? It seems to be that CBD, over the past 10 years, has been vanishing from cannabis in Europe. These are UK figures. 2002, 30% of cannabis was skunk type with no CBD. It increased 3 years later to 55%, and then again to 80%. In our sample of 600 young people, 80% were using skunk. So what's happening over time is that CBD is being taken away from cannabis. Why is this? Well, certainly in the UK, and I'm just back from Denmark and it's happening there as well, is that most cannabis has been grown intensively in illegal farms in the UK and in Denmark. This is mostly by Vietnamese gangs, and they're growing it indoors so they can't be detected as easily by the police. And what they do is they maximise the THC content, so it's really, really strong. But because they grow it under 24-hour lighting, it destroys the CBD in the plant. So this is what's been happening over the last 10 years. This is why we're facing an enormous change in cannabis addiction. In Colorado, it makes me laugh because their recreational marijuana, they're selling, it looks like a sweet shop. You go in there and you see there's chocolate truffles with THC in, but they're not putting any CBD in. So this is a bit like Alka-Pops. Young kids will be seeing cannabis in chocolates, not knowing that they should be having CBD as well as THC, and they shouldn't really be having anything before they're adults, because it affects the plasticity in the brain, which develops hugely during puberty and adolescence. But it's irresponsible of Colorado to sell things like this without balancing the number of the cannabinoids in it. Medical marijuana, has been mentioned, is now available in an enormous number of countries, and 20 of the US states now allow it. And the main symptoms it's being prescribed for are pain, anxiety, sleep. And in California, we're working with one clinic there. They've discovered a new psychiatric disorder, which is called writer's block. You can actually get a prescription from your doctor for writer's block. The cannabis plant, I've only talked about THC and CBD, but there are more than 100 other cannabinoids in the plant. We know that potentially, therefore, it's the most fantastic source of medicines. Okay, I meant to have a slide in it, got lost, about the medical use. Now, these cannabinoids, THC and CBD, are now being used throughout Europe, Australia, and Canada for multiple sclerosis. They help people with multiple sclerosis not have these kind of reflex actions that stop them sleeping. THC on its own is used for nausea associated with radiotherapy, and now just started in 15 clinical sites in the States. CBD is being used for childhood severe forms of epilepsy. These are only just beginning. There's a trial being done in Germany last year showing that CBD helps in schizophrenia. So there are lots of potential medical uses of this plant that we should really build on. I just wanted to end up quickly in 5 minutes talking about drugs as a whole, the overall harms of drugs. That's something that Professor David Nutt's been looking at as part of the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs. And what this has done over the last few years is to rate 20 of the most commonly used recreational drugs all together. Difficult exercise. And I know it's a bit difficult to see, but they've established a network of harms, not only to the self, to the person using the drug, but harms to society, harms to other people. And okay. And the first paper that came out in The Lancet in 2010. And as you see, alcohol actually turned out, in terms of harms to self, total harms to self and others, as actually being more damaging than many of the illicit drugs. I mean, that will make sense to a lot of you because you know of all the side effects in terms of social effects of alcohol, as well as increased liver problems. I mean, liver disease is the one increasing disease at the moment in the Western world, much more than anything else. And then just here in Brussels a few months ago, we all met to get a European view on this. So there were 19 different European countries who came together, drug experts from all those fields, often 2 or 3 from each country. And we did the same ranking exercise again to try and get a European-wide view. And actually what we found is very, very similar to what had been found previously. Again, alcohol came up as number 1, heroin as number 2. We think that these rankings in terms of harms to users and harms to others might be useful in policy, because there was no relation at all between the rankings of the drugs by the experts and where those drugs sit in the legal system of any European country. No correspondence at all, suggesting that the classification of drugs bears no relation to actual harms of drugs. So that, starting with the Nostel and the Lancet, Van Amsterdam in the Netherlands has done a similar thing, again showing similar results. The new EU rankings, again by experts, show similar results. We published later this year. And we've, with my colleague Celia Morgan, done 2 studies now with users involving over 3,000 people using drugs. And we found that drug users agree very strongly with the experts, and again, no relation to any legal restrictions on drugs. So to conclude, I'm aware that to date drug policy has not been helped much by findings from drug science, and that's partly because most drug policies have existed for decades in most countries, whereas much of drug science is very new. At the same time, we think that drug science is an important, if changing, because the drug world changes all the time. We've got the new psychoactives coming in, we've got different kinds of cannabis. It's a changing evidence base, but it's still an important evidence base which we think policy should take account of. And finally, I also want to make a plea as a scientist is that the legal status of a drug can often restrict the amount of research we can do on it. Okay, so thank you. The website there is Drug Science and has masses of information about drugs.
Thank you very much, Val, and an accommodation and recommendation to that particular website in the policy debate.